The line between life and death in the western frontier was often as thin as a whisper. For Sarah Mason, that line would be tested when a simple act of compassion changed the course of her life forever. What happens when an isolated widow defies the hatred of her town to help a wounded enemy? And what forces arrive at dawn 2 days later, sending tremors through the earth that could be felt for miles? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona Territory, 1878. Heat rose from the cracked earth, like breath from the devil's own mouth. Sarah Mason stood on her porch, shielding her eyes against the merciless sun that had scorched her land for 43 days without relief. The cattle were thin, the crops withered, and the well was nearly dry. 3 more weeks without rain, and there would be nothing left of the Mason Ranch but dust and broken dreams. Sarah was 32, though the harsh frontier had aged her beyond her years. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 8 months now, taken by a bullet during a failed bank robbery in the nearby town of Copper Springs. The townsfolk had helped bury him, brought food for a week, then left her to survive on her own. A woman alone on a struggling ranch was considered as good as gone in these parts. But Sarah wasn't going anywhere. This land, with its stubborn mesquite trees and defiant wildflowers that somehow bloomed despite the drought, was all she had left. Each morning she rose before dawn to mend fences, tend the few remaining cattle, and pray for clouds that never came. On this particular evening, Sarah was dragging a fallen fence post back toward the barn when she saw something unusual on the eastern ridge. At first, it appeared to be a bundle of rags or perhaps a dead coyote, but as the setting sun cast long shadows across the valley, the shape moved, ever so slightly, but it moved. Sarah reached for the rifle she kept slung across her back. Thomas had taught her to shoot years ago, though she'd never had cause to aim at anything more threatening than coyotes. With cautious steps, she approached the ridge, her heart thumping hard against her ribs. It was a man, not just any man, an Apache. His black hair hung in tangled strands around a face etched with pain. Blood had soaked through his buckskin shirt, creating a dark stain that spread across his right shoulder. A bullet wound, fresh and ugly. His breath came in shallow gasps, eyes closed, hovering somewhere between this world and the next. Sarah's grip tightened on her rifle. The stories rushed through her mind, stories of Apache raids on settlements, of burned homesteads and slaughtered families. Just last month, the Peterson farm 10 miles north had been attacked. No survivors. The town had formed a militia, vowing to shoot any Apache on sight. She should go for the sheriff, or better yet, leave him be. Nature had its own way of settling scores, and this man's score was nearly settled. But something made her pause. Maybe it was the memory of Thomas, who, despite his roughness, had believed that a person's character showed in how they treated those who could do nothing for them. Or maybe it was simply that Sarah had seen enough death. The Apache's eyes suddenly flickered open, dark, intense, fevered. They fixed on Sarah with a mixture of defiance and resignation. He made no move to fight or flee. He couldn't. Instead, a strange calm seemed to pass between them, an understanding with no need for words. Sarah lowered her rifle and took a half-step backward. Then, making a decision she couldn't fully explain even to herself, she turned and walked back to the house. Inside, she filled her only canteen with the precious remaining well water and grabbed the small medicine box Thomas had kept stocked, with whiskey, bandages, and crude surgical tools. When she returned, the Apache hadn't moved, though his eyes followed her approach. Sarah knelt beside him, keeping a careful distance. She uncorked the canteen, and after a moment's hesitation held it out to him. "Water," she said, knowing he might not understand her words but would recognize her intent. He studied her for a long moment, suspicion warring with desperate thirst. Then, with effort that sent fresh blood seeping through his shirt, he raised himself slightly on one elbow. Sarah, surprising herself, moved closer and gently lifted his head, helping him drink. The Apache took 3 small sips before collapsing, back, exhaling sharply through clenched teeth. Up close, Sarah could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with a jagged scar running from his right eyebrow to his jawline. Silver and turquoise beads adorned a leather cord around his neck, alongside what appeared to be a bear claw. "I don't know what you were doing out here alone," Sarah said more to herself than to him, "but you're not going to make it through the night without help." The Apache watched her with wary eyes as she examined his wound. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, which was fortunate, but infection had already set in. Sarah poured whiskey on a cloth and pressed it against both the entry and exit wounds. The man didn't cry out, though his entire body tensed, a vein throbbing visibly in his neck. As she worked, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. In Copper Springs, they'd be lighting the lamps in the saloon about now, the miners and cowboys gathering for cards and whiskey. If any of them knew what she was doing, they'd call her a traitor, or worse. Sheriff Barnes had made no secret of his hatred for the Apache people, claiming they understood nothing but violence. Yet here was this man, wounded and alone, who had made no move to harm her despite her vulnerability. There was something in his eyes, not savagery but a deep intelligence, an assessment of her that went beyond seeing her as either threat or ally. With the wound cleaned and bandaged, Sarah sat back on her heels. Night was falling fast, and with it the desert chill. The Apache would freeze before morning if left exposed on the ridge. "I can't bring you into the house," she said firmly, though unsure if he comprehended. "But there's shelter in the barn." She stood and pointed toward the weathered structure. The Apache's gaze followed her gesture, then returned to her face. Slowly, painfully, he attempted to stand. Sarah hesitated, then offered her shoulder for support. After a moment's consideration, he accepted, his weight heavy against her as they began the slow journey down the ridge. The barn was simple: a few stalls for horses, storage for feed, and a small loft where Sarah kept hay. She helped the Apache to a corner where clean straw was piled, then fetched a threadbare blanket from a hook near the door. As she spread it over him, she noticed his eyelids growing heavy, the fever taking its toll. "I'll return in the morning," she said, placing the canteen within his reach. "Try to rest." The Apache nodded once, a small gesture, but enough to confirm he understood more than she'd assumed. As Sarah turned to leave, his hand caught her wrist. The touch was light but firm. She froze, suddenly aware of her isolation, of how easily he could overpower her despite his injury. Instead, he simply held her gaze and spoke a single word: "Mako." Sarah frowned, uncomprehending. He touched his chest. "Mako," he repeated, then released her wrist. Understanding dawned. His name. He had given her his name. "Sarah," she replied, touching her own chest. "Sarah Mason." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile passed across Mako's face before he closed his eyes, surrendering to exhaustion. Sarah secured the barn door and walked back to her house, her thoughts in turmoil. She had just hidden an Apache warrior, the sworn enemy of everyone in Copper Springs, in her barn. If discovered, she might face more than just scorn. Harboring an Apache could be seen as aiding the enemy. Yet as she prepared for bed, checking that her rifle was loaded and within reach as always, Sarah couldn't bring herself to regret her decision. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles. For tonight, she had done what she believed was right. What she couldn't know was that her simple act of mercy had set in motion events that would shake the very foundations of her world. Mako was not just any Apache warrior, and his absence had already been noted by those who would stop at nothing to find him. 2 days later, as the first light of dawn broke over the eastern mountains, Sarah Mason would discover exactly who and what she had saved. Sarah woke before sunrise, as was her habit. For a moment, the events of the previous evening seemed like a dream, until she looked out her window toward the barn, and reality came rushing back. She had taken in a wounded Apache warrior. The enemy. Copper Springs had buried 4 families. In the past year alone, after Apache raids, Sheriff Barnes displayed a collection of Apache arrowheads in his office like trophies, each one representing what he called justice served. The last town meeting had ended with talks of forming a larger militia to drive the savages back where they belong. Yet there Sarah stood, heating water for coffee and gathering fresh bandages, preparing to tend to the very man her neighbors would shoot on sight. When she entered the barn, the cool morning air heavy with the scent of hay and horses, she half expected to find it empty. Instead, Mako sat upright against the wall, alert despite the pallor of fever on his face. The blanket she'd given him was folded neatly beside him. His dark eyes tracked her movements as she set down her supplies. "You need to eat," Sarah said, offering him a piece of cornbread and dried beef, "to regain your strength." Mako accepted the food with a slight nod, but didn't immediately eat. Instead, he broke the cornbread in half and extended a portion back. To her, a sharing gesture. Sarah hesitated, then took it, understanding the significance. They ate in silence, the morning light gradually strengthening through the barn's small windows. "Your wound needs cleaning again," Sarah said when they'd finished. She gestured to his shoulder. Mako removed the blood-stained bandage himself, revealing the angry red flesh beneath. The wound looked better than she'd expected, not healed by any means, but the bleeding had slowed. Sarah poured fresh water over it, then applied a poultice of crushed herbs she'd gathered from her small garden. Her mother had taught her the healing properties of plants long before doctors became available in towns like Copper Springs. As she worked, Sarah found herself studying Mako more carefully. His features were strong, high cheekbones, a straight nose, and eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him. Despite his injury, there was a controlled power in the way he held himself, like a coiled spring waiting to release. "Why were you alone?" she asked, not expecting an answer. "Apache usually travel in groups." To her surprise, Mako responded, his English broken but understandable. "Scouts! Watch soldier camp!" He made a gesture like rifle fire. "They shoot!" Sarah's hands stilled. "You were watching the cavalry." The nearest military outpost was Fort McDowell, about 20 miles east, Mako's. Expression darkened. "They come to our land. Build more." He touched his wound. "I escape, others not." A scouting mission gone wrong. Sarah felt a chill. If Mako was part of a larger Apache band monitoring military movements, others would be looking for him. And if the cavalry had engaged with Apache scouts, they'd be on high alert too. "You can't stay here," she said firmly. "It's not safe for either of us." Mako studied her face. "Why do you help? White woman help Apache." The question caught Sarah off guard. Why had she helped him? It wasn't logical or safe. She thought about Thomas, about the principles he'd tried to live by, despite his flaws. "Because you're human," she finally said, "and hurt. That's reason enough." Something shifted in Mako's gaze. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. He reached for the bear claw pendant around his neck and held it out toward her, not removing it, but offering it for her to see. "Spirit bear," he explained. "Guide who is lost, protect who shows courage." His eyes held hers. "You have a bear spirit. No fear when others are afraid." Sarah withdrew her hand, uncomfortable with the assessment. "I'm plenty afraid," she admitted. "The town would hang me if they knew you were here." Mako let the pendant fall back against his chest. "I leave when the sun high," he said. "Return to my people." Relief and something like disappointment mingled in Sarah's chest. It was the sensible solution. He was well enough to travel, and each hour he remained increased the danger to them both. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Yet part of her wondered about the world he would return to, a world she knew nothing about, beyond stories designed to instill fear. "You'll need provisions," she said, rising to her feet. "I'll bring what I can spare." When she returned to the barn with a small pack containing jerky, cornbread, and a flask of water, Mako was standing, testing his strength. He moved with a slight stiffness, but appeared steadier than she'd expected. He'd rebraided his long hair and washed the blood from his face with the water she had left earlier. "I go now," he said, accepting the provisions with a solemn nod. "Safer for you." Sarah walked with him to the barn door, peering out to ensure no unexpected visitors were approaching the ranch. The land stretched empty in all directions, shimmering already with the day's building heat. "There's a ravine to the south," she said, pointing. "It leads to the foothills. You'll find better cover there than crossing the open valley." Mako followed her gaze, then looked back at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Sarah Mason," he said, pronouncing her name carefully. "My people remember who helps, who harms." He touched his wound, then pressed his hand briefly to his heart. "I remember." Before she could respond, he slipped out of the barn and moved with surprising speed toward the ravine she had indicated. Within minutes, he had disappeared from view, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of her secret and the uncertain consequences of her compassion. The day passed slowly. Sarah went about her usual chores, feeding the chickens, mending a tear in the barn roof, checking on her meager garden. But her thoughts kept drifting to Mako. Had he made it back to his people? Or had he been recaptured by the cavalry? Or, worse, collapsed somewhere in the wilderness, his wound reopened from exertion? As evening approached, Sarah caught herself repeatedly scanning the horizon, though whether hoping to see Mako or fearing the arrival of others, she couldn't say. The sun was just beginning to set when she heard hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town. She tensed, reaching for her rifle before recognizing the distinctive gait of Sheriff Barnes's sorrel mare. She set the rifle aside, but kept it within reach, and wiped her hands on her apron as the sheriff rode into view. He was a bulky man, with a bushy mustache and small, watchful eyes. Behind him rode two other men Sarah recognized, Franklin Reed, who owned the general store, and young Billy Turner, barely 20, but eager to prove himself to the older men of Copper Springs. "Evening, Mrs. Mason," Barnes called as he dismounted, tipping his hat with forced politeness. "Hope we're not disturbing you." "Sheriff," Sarah acknowledged, remaining on her porch. "What brings you out this way? Ranch is a fair ride from town." Barnes hitched his thumbs in his belt, glancing around the property with obvious scrutiny. "Had some trouble with Apache in the area. Cavalry engaged a group of scouts 2 days back near Fort McDowell. Got most of them, but one slipped away. Wounded. From the blood trail they found." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "That's so?" Barnes spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Blood trail led west before they lost it. That's this direction, in case you haven't noticed your compass lately." "I'm aware of where the west is, Sheriff." Barnes's eyes narrowed slightly. At her tone, "Been any strangers around these parts? Any signs of someone passing through? Bloodstains, missing supplies?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "No strangers, no theft, just me trying to keep this place from turning to dust in the drought." Reed stepped forward, his thin face pinched with suspicion. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Mason, but we noticed fresh tracks heading south from your property. Looked recent. I rode that way this morning." Sarah lied smoothly, checking the south fence line. "One of my steers got through a gap last week." Young Billy was circling toward the barn, peering inside with unconcealed curiosity. Sarah's heart impounded, but she forced herself to remain calm. There would be nothing to find now. "Any particular reason you're searching my property, gentlemen?" she asked, infusing her voice with just enough indignation. "Last I checked, this land belongs to me." Barnes removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. "No offense intended, ma'am. Just doing our duty. Apache warriors aren't known for their mercy, especially toward women living alone." His eyes lingered on her face. "It would be a shame if something happened to you out here with no one to help." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Sarah straightened her spine. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I've managed on my own these 8 months since Thomas passed. I reckon I'll continue to do so." Barnes replaced his hat. "As you wish, but you'd be wise to keep that rifle loaded, Mrs. Mason. And if you see anything unusual, you ride straight for town." He turned to his companions. "Let's move on. Still, got daylight to check the Peterson place." As they mounted up, Barnes cast one final look at Sarah. "These Apache, they're not like us. They don't think like Christians. Don't mistake them for men with conscience or mercy. They're savages, plain and simple." Sarah watched them ride away, tension coiled tight in her chest. Only when they disappeared over the ridge did she allow herself to exhale fully. She had lied to the sheriff, a man who could easily turn the town against her if he suspected her. Deception. Worse, she had aided someone the cavalry was actively hunting. The consequences, if discovered, would be severe. Yet, as darkness settled over the ranch and Sarah prepared for another night alone, she couldn't bring herself to regret her actions. Mako's words echoed in her mind. "My people remember who helps, who harms." What she couldn't know was how soon that memory would be tested, or that in just one more day, at dawn, her horizon would fill with the silhouettes of warriors who had, indeed, remembered. Sleep came fitfully to Sarah that night, her dreams haunted by Barnes's thinly veiled threats and Mako's intense gaze. She woke several times, startling at the ordinary sounds of the desert night. Coyotes calling in the distance, the wind rattling the loose shutter she hadn't yet fixed, an owl hunting near the barn. Dawn was still an hour away when she finally gave up on rest. She dressed quickly in the darkness, her movements practiced from years of early mornings on the ranch. The kettle was just beginning to boil for coffee when Sarah noticed something odd through her kitchen window. Silence. Complete and absolute. No birds called. No insects chirped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The hair on the back of Sarah's neck rose as she moved to the window, straining to see beyond the yard in the pre-dawn gloom. Nothing moved on the horizon, yet she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She retrieved her rifle from beside the door and stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath her boots. The eastern sky had just begun to lighten, transforming. Black to deep blue, then to pale lavender, and then she saw them. At first they were merely shadows against the dawn, a line of mounted figures along the ridge where she had found Mako. As the light strengthened, details emerged. 20, perhaps 30 Apache warriors sat motionless on their ponies, watching her ranch in eerie silence. Their faces were painted with ochre and black stripes, feathers and animal teeth adorning their hair. Each man carried a rifle or bow. Though none were raised, Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs. She considered running for her horse, making a desperate dash for town, but knew she would never outpace them. Besides, they weren't charging. They were waiting. A single rider detached from the line and moved forward. Even at a distance, Sarah recognized Mako. He sat tall and proud on a paint Mustang, his wound evidently having improved enough for riding. He wore no war paint like the others, but a ceremonial headband with a single eagle feather adorned his hair. Around his neck gleamed the bear claw pendant. He rode directly toward the house, stopping a respectful distance from the porch. His Expression revealed nothing as he studied her standing there, rifle in hand. "Sarah Mason," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the silent morning air. "My people come." "I can see that," she replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Why?" Mako dismounted with fluid grace that showed little evidence of his injury. "To give thanks. To see who helped when others would kill." Before Sarah could respond, the line of warriors began moving. They descended from the ridge in perfect formation, their ponies' hooves stirring up dust in the growing light. Within minutes, they had surrounded the ranch, forming a circle around the house, barn, and small corral. Not one raised a weapon, yet their presence was unmistakably intimidating. "You're scaring me," Sarah admitted, her grip tightening on her rifle. "And if anyone from town rides by and sees this, they'll bring the cavalry down on all of us." Mako nodded once, acknowledging her fear without dismissing it. "No harm comes to you. I am Naicha's son." The name meant nothing to Sarah until Mako continued. "My father leads many bands, many warriors. You saved the son of a chief." The implications stunned her. She had not just helped any Apache, she had helped the son of a powerful leader. No wonder so many had come, but was it for gratitude or something else? "What do you want from me?" she asked directly. Mako approached the porch steps, but didn't climb them, maintaining the boundary between them. "My father sends a gift, protection." He gestured to the warriors. "This land is now safe." "Safe?" Sarah almost laughed. "Having 30 Apache warriors surrounding my ranch is the opposite of safe in this territory." "I can't accept these," she said finally. "Your people need them more than I do." Mako's expression shifted slightly. Surprise, perhaps respect. "Second gift, then." He nodded to another warrior who came forward carrying a deerskin pouch. "Medicine," Mako explained, "for fever, for pain, for wounds that don't heal." The pouch contained dried herbs, roots, and powders Sarah didn't recognize. This gift was less visible, less likely to raise questions in town, yet potentially more. Invaluable than the horses. Good medicine was scarce in the territory. "Why?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "Why risk coming here in such numbers for someone who only gave you water and bandaged a wound?" Mako's gaze intensified. "In the desert, water is life. You gave water to the enemy, showed courage no man in your town has." He touched his healing shoulder. "Among my people, debt of life must be repaid." As they spoke, the sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across the yard. The Apache warriors remained in their circle, patient and watchful. Sarah realized with growing unease that their presence, while not immediately threatening to her, would be visible for miles. If Barnes or any of his men happened to ride by— "You need to leave," she said urgently. "The town, the cavalry, they'll see you. They will come." Mako agreed with surprising calm. "But not today. Today they drink." He gestured toward town with a slight smile. "New whiskey wagon arrived yesterday. Men celebrate." Sarah couldn't help a small, startled laugh. Of course Mako would know this. His people clearly had their own scouts watching the town. The knowledge both reassured and disturbed her. How much did they see? How long had they been watching? One of the warriors near the south end of the property suddenly raised his hand, giving a low whistle. Immediately the atmosphere changed. Warriors straightened, hands moving to weapons. Mako turned sharply, scanning the horizon. "Riders," he said tersely. "3 from town." Panic flashed through Sarah. "You have to go, now." But instead of retreating, Mako issued rapid commands in Apache. The warriors smoothly reorganized, half disappearing behind the barn and ridge, the others spreading out to appear less numerous. Within seconds, what had been an overwhelming force appeared to be just a handful of Apache passing through. "No time to leave," Mako explained. "Better to look like a small hunting party." Sarah's mind raced. Even a small group of Apache on her. property would raise an alarm. They'll still shoot first and ask questions later. Not if you speak to them first. Marco's confidence was unnerving. Say we trade. Many settlers trade with Apache away from town eyes. It was true. Despite the open hostility between settlers and Apache, there existed an underground economy. Some ranchers exchanged food and tools for furs and horses, keeping these dealings secret from townspeople like Barnes, who advocated for extermination rather than coexistence. The riders were close enough now to make out their features. Sarah's heart sank. Billy Turner rode in front, flanked by two men she recognized from the saloon. Troublemakers with quick tempers and poor judgment, especially when alcohol was involved. The worst possible combination. "Those men won't listen," she said quietly. "They're young, foolish, eager to make names for themselves." Marco studied the approaching riders, then turned to Sarah with unexpected gentleness. "You have a choice. Stand with us or step aside." He touched the bear claw pendant. "Bear spirit already knows your heart." Sarah looked from the approaching riders to the Apache warriors, who had rearranged themselves to appear less threatening while maintaining tactical positions. She thought of Barnes and his threats, of the town that had all but abandoned her after Thomas died, of Marco, who had shared his name and his bread with her despite his wound and her part in the society that had caused it. At that moment, the choice seemed both impossible and inevitable. "Get behind the house," she said firmly, stepping off the porch. "Make it look like you're trading horses. I'll handle them." Marco nodded once, signaling his men to follow her suggestion. He remained beside her as Billy and his companions rode into the yard, their horses skidding to a halt when they spotted the Apache. Billy's hand immediately went to his pistol. "Mrs. Mason!" he called, eyes wide with alarm. "Get away from him!" Sarah stepped forward, deliberately placing herself between the young men and Marco. "Put that gun away, Billy Turner. These men are here to trade, and they're doing it peacefully." The young man's face flushed red. "Trade with Apache?" He spat on the ground. "Sheriff Barnes was right about you. Said you might be an Indian lover." "I'm a woman trying to survive on her own," Sarah replied evenly. "These horses are worth more than anything your store would trade me. Now lower your weapon before someone gets hurt." Billy's companions looked uncertain, glancing between Sarah, the visible Apache, and the distant town. One leaned over to whisper something to Billy, who shook his head stubbornly. "The sheriff needs to know about this," Billy insisted. "Apache killed the Petersons, killed others too." "Not these Apache," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt, "and not on my land." The standoff stretched, tense seconds ticking by. Behind her, Sarah could feel Marco's presence, solid, unafraid. She wondered if the hidden warriors had arrows trained on Billy and his friends. She wondered which side she was truly on. Billy finally lowered his pistol, though his expression remained mutinous. "This ain't right, Mrs. Mason. The town won't stand for it." "The town doesn't own my land or dictate my business," Sarah replied. "Now, unless you've come to trade fairly, I suggest you head back to Copper Springs." The three exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge both Sarah and the Apache they could see. Finally, Billy jerked his horse around. "Sheriff, we'll hear about this," he called over his shoulder as they rode away. "Mark my words." Sarah watched them go, her momentary courage fading as the implications of what she'd done sank in. She had openly defied the town's unspoken rules. Worse, she had aligned herself with the Apache in front of witnesses. There would be consequences. As Billy and his companions disappeared down the dusty road, the hidden Apache warriors emerged from their positions. Their expressions remained impassive, but Sarah sensed a new respect in the way they regarded her. She had chosen to stand with them against her own kind, a decision that had irrevocably altered her path. "They will return," Marco said, watching the dust cloud fade in the distance. "With more men. I know." Sarah's voice was steady despite the trembling in her hands. "You should go before they do." Instead of answering, Mako turned to his warriors and spoke rapidly in Apache. The men nodded and began to dismount, tethering their horses in the shade behind the barn. Some collected wood for a fire, others unpacked bundles from their mounts, and still others moved to strategic positions around the property, settling in with the patience of men accustomed to long watches. "What are they doing?" Sarah asked, alarmed. "I told you to leave." "They prepare." Mako's expression was resolute. "My father's words, the woman who saves a chief's son receives the protection of the tribe. Your protection will bring the cavalry down on all of us." "The cavalry already hunts us." Mako's voice remained calm. "But today we choose the ground." Sarah realized with growing dread what was happening. The Apache weren't simply delivering gifts or paying respects. They were establishing a defensive position. Her ranch was about to become the front line in a conflict she had never meant to join. "This is madness," she whispered. "They'll kill us all." Mako studied her face. "You fear death?" "I fear needless death," she corrected. "There must be another way." For the first time, something like uncertainty crossed Mako's features. "What way? Your people want our land, our destruction. The army builds more forts, more soldiers come each season." He gestured toward the horizon. Soon, nowhere for Apache to hunt, to live. The painful truth of his words hung between them. Sarah had heard the talk in town about clearing the territory of Apache presence, had seen the increasing cavalry patrols. There were even rumors of Apache children being taken from their families and sent east for civilization. "Let me go. To town," she said suddenly. "Talk to them before they come armed. Maybe I can explain." "Explain what?" Mako's tone hardened. "That you choose Apache over settlers? They will not listen. To them you are already a traitor." A warrior approached, speaking urgently to Mako in their native tongue. Mako's expression darkened as he replied. "What is it?" Sarah asked when the warrior departed. "Scouts report riders gathering in town. Many." Mako turned to her, his decision made. "No time for town talk now. You have a choice. Stay and fight beside us, or take a horse and ride east before fighting starts." The offer stunned her. He was giving her a way out, a chance to escape the coming confrontation. Part of her wanted desperately to take it, to flee the violence that seemed inevitable. But where would she go? And what would happen to her ranch, her home, everything she had struggled to maintain since Thomas died? "This is my land," she said finally. "I won't abandon it." Something flashed in Mako's eyes, approval, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. He nodded once, then removed his bear claw pendant and held it out to her. "Wear this," he said, "so all warriors know you stand with us." Sarah hesitated, then allowed him to place the necklace over her head. The bear claw rested against her collarbone, warm from his body. The gesture felt significant, though she couldn't fully grasp its meaning. "What now?" she asked. "Now we prepare." Mako turned toward the house. "Show me where best to defend." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Sarah found herself working alongside the Apache warriors, moving water barrels to strategic positions, reinforcing windows, creating barricades from furniture and fence posts. It struck her as surreal. These men, whom she had been taught to fear, were now fortifying her home, prepared to defend it with their lives. Mako inspected their work with a critical eye, issuing commands that were obeyed without question. Sarah realized he must hold significant rank among his people, beyond simply being the chief's son. His wound seemed all but forgotten as he moved with purpose and authority. "Your men follow you well," she observed as they blocked the back entrance with a heavy cabinet. "They follow because I was first chosen by my father to make peace talk with white leaders," Mako replied, surprising her. "Before this," he touched his healing shoulder, "I spoke with Army Colonel about the new treaty." "You were a peace emissary?" Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "But the town says Apache only want war." "Some do. after what the army did to our villages." His expression darkened. "But my father knows fighting alone will end with Apache bones in the desert. Peace talk was hope." He met her eyes directly, "until soldiers shot peace talkers." The revelation shook Sarah. If what he said was true, if the military had fired on peace emissaries, the situation was even worse than she had imagined. No wonder Mako's father had sent warriors when he learned his son survived. This wasn't just about repaying a debt. It was about demonstrating the Apache wouldn't be eliminated without a fight. A shout came from one of the lookouts positioned on the ridge. Mako tensed, moving swiftly to the front porch. Sarah followed, her heart racing. In the distance, a cloud of dust rose from the direction of Copper Springs. The riders were coming. "How many?" she asked, straining to see. 20, maybe more," Mako replied, counting the figures emerging from the dust. "Your sheriff, some townsfolk, some cavalry." Barnes had managed to rouse not just the town, but also some of the military stationed near Copper Springs. The sight of blue uniforms among the approaching riders confirmed Sarah's worst fears. "They'll have better weapons than your warriors," she said quietly. Mako's expression remained impassive. "We have a better position, better knowledge of Death's shadow." He glanced at her. "And we have right." As the riders drew closer, Sarah could make out individual faces. Sheriff Barnes rode at the front, his features set in grim determination. Beside him was a cavalry officer she didn't recognize, probably from Fort McDowell. Behind them came townsfolk armed with rifles and shotguns, storekeepers, ranchers, miners, men she had known for years, now coming to attack her home. The riders halted about 100 yards from the house. Barnes raised a hand, signaling the others to wait, as he and the cavalry officer rode forward a short distance. "Sarah Mason," Barnes called, his voice carrying across the yard. "Send out the Apache and come with us. This is your only warning." Sarah stepped forward, aware of Mako beside her and the warriors hidden in strategic positions around the property. She took a deep breath, knowing her next words would seal her fate. "This is my land, Sheriff Barnes," she called back. "These people are under my protection as guests. You have no right to threaten them or me." Barnes's face darkened with anger. "No right? These savages have killed dozens of settlers. They're enemies of every decent white person in the territory. And how many Apache have been killed by settlers?" Sarah challenged, surprising herself with her boldness. "How many by the cavalry?" The officer beside Barnes spurred his horse forward. "A few steps." "Woman, you are harboring hostiles in violation of territorial law. The military has authority to remove them by force if necessary." "They came in peace," Sarah insisted. "To trade and to give thanks for an act of kindness." "Kindness?" Barnes spat on the ground. "You gave aid to the enemy. That makes you a traitor." The word hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Around her, Sarah could feel the Apache warriors tensing, ready for the first shot to be fired. Mako remained still beside her, his presence steady and resolute. "I gave water to a wounded man," Sarah said, loud enough for all to hear. "If that makes me a traitor to your cause, then perhaps your cause isn't as righteous as you claim." A murmur ran through the gathered men. Some looked uncertain, glancing at each other with hesitation. Others gripped their weapons tighter, eager for conflict. Barnes conferred briefly with the officer, their expressions growing darker. "Last chance, Mrs. Mason," Barnes called. "Step aside and let us deal with these Apache, or we'll consider you one of them." Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. They had already decided she was the enemy. There would be no middle ground, no compromise. She touched the bear claw pendant at her throat, drawing strength from its presence. "I've made my choice, Sheriff," she replied clearly. "This is my land, and I stand with those who respect it." Barnes nodded grimly, as if her answer was exactly what he'd expected. He turned to the men behind him, gesturing for them to spread out. The cavalry officer began issuing commands, positioning his soldiers for an assault. Among the gathered townsmen, Sarah spotted familiar faces. Mr. Henderson from the livery, who had helped her after Thomas died, Frank Peterson, whose brother's family had been killed in an Apache raid, even old Dr. Wilson, who had tended Thomas in his final hours. Their expressions ranged from anger to confusion to sorrow. These were men who had once welcomed her, who had once called her neighbor. "They think they're saving you," Mako observed, following her gaze. "From us, from yourself." "They don't understand," Sarah replied. "They see only what they've been. They're taught to see." A commotion arose from the back of the crowd as someone pushed their way forward. To Sarah's surprise, Reverend Mitchell, Copper Springs' aging preacher, rode up beside Barnes. His weathered face was creased with concern as he surveyed the standoff. "Sheriff, perhaps we should hear the woman out," the Reverend suggested. "Violence should be our last resort, not our first," Barnes scowled. "With all due respect, Reverend, this isn't church business. These Apache have blood on their hands." "And we do not?" The Reverend's voice carried clearly across the yard. "I've buried too many souls, Indian and white alike. More blood won't wash away what's already spilled," a murmur ran through the gathered men. Some nodded in agreement with the Reverend's words, while others gripped their weapons tighter. The cavalry officer looked distinctly uncomfortable with this unexpected intervention. Sarah saw her opportunity. "Reverend Mitchell speaks wisely," she called out. "There's been enough death on both sides. These men came in peace, to honor a debt and offer protection. They could have killed me when they found me alone. Instead, they brought gifts and respect." "Gifts?" someone in the crowd called skeptically. "What kind of gifts would savages bring?" Sarah gestured to the 3 Mustangs grazing peacefully in her corral. "Horses, for one, medicine for another. They honor their promises. Can we say the same?" More murmuring among the townsmen. The cavalry officer conferred again with Barnes. Their conversation heated, though too quiet to overhear. Mako remained still beside Sarah, his warriors hidden but alert around the property. "They will attack soon," Mako said quietly, "when the sun is at highest point." "How do you know?" "Military always attacks at noon. They believe Apache pray to sun then. We'll be distracted." A faint smile touched his lips. "They are wrong." Sarah looked at the approaching midday, then back at the men preparing to attack her home. "Will your warriors kill them?" "Only if necessary." Mako's gaze was steady. "We did not come for bloodshed, but we will not die without sending others to the spirit world first." 2 of Barnes's deputies had begun unloading what looked like dynamite from their saddlebags, enough to reduce Sarah's small ranch house to splinters. The sight of it made her stomach turn. They were prepared to destroy everything she had fought to preserve. "They'd rather burn me out than let me choose my own path," she said bitterly. Mako nodded. "The weapon of those who cannot win with truth." From his position beside the cavalry officer, Barnes raised a megaphone. "This is your final warning. We have explosives, and will use them if necessary. Send out the Apache unarmed, or we attack." In 10 minutes, one of Mako's warriors appeared silently at his side, whispering something urgent in his ear. Mako's expression changed subtly, a flash of surprise, quickly masked. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "My father comes." Mako's voice held, a mixture of pride and concern. "With many more warriors." Sarah's eyes widened. "How many more?" "Enough to end this today." He looked at her intently. "But many would die. Your people, my people, you." The gravity of the situation pressed down on Sarah. Men would likely die today, men she had known, perhaps even men she had once called friends. And it had all begun with her simple act of compassion for a wounded enemy. Was it worth it? She whispered, more to herself than to Mako. One act of mercy leading to all this. Mako turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "One act of mercy is how worlds change, Sarah Mason. Like stone thrown in still water, ripples go far beyond where stone lands." He paused, then made a decision. I will speak to them. They'll shoot you on sight, Sarah protested. Perhaps. Mako removed his weapons, handing them to the nearest warrior. But a chief's son must show courage when words might prevent death. Before Sarah could stop him, Mako stepped off the porch and walked slowly into the open yard. He raised his empty hands high, showing he carried no weapons. The reaction from Barnes and his men was immediate. Rifles raised, hammers cocked. Hold your fire, Reverend Mitchell shouted, moving his horse between the townsman and Mako. For God's sake, let the man speak. A tense silence fell as Mako continued his deliberate walk toward the gathered settlers. Sarah held her breath, acutely aware of dozens of fingers resting on triggers, of the hidden Apache warriors with arrows nocked, of how quickly this moment could dissolve into bloodshed. I am Mako, son of Chief Naiche, he called, his voice strong and clear. I come to speak the truth before blood is shed. The cavalry officer nudged his horse forward slightly. We know who you are. You were at Fort McDowell 3 days ago, spying on our positions. Not spying, Mako corrected calmly. Carrying a peace message from my father. Your soldiers fired. Without words. Lies, someone shouted from the crowd. Apache don't want peace. Mako stood firm, his bearing regal despite his simple clothing and recent wound. My father sends a message. Today, you face not just warriors you see, but hundreds more who watch from hills. He gestured toward the distant ridges. They wait. For a signal, for your first shot. Sarah could see doubt and fear spreading through the townsmen as they nervously scanned the surrounding landscape. Even if they couldn't see Mako's reinforcements, the possibility of their presence was enough to create uncertainty. This woman, Mako continued, pointing to Sarah, saved my life when your bullets sought to end it. She gave water, medicine, shelter. In return, my people offer protection. He paused, letting his words take root. Not a threat, protection from raiders, from those who would take her land while you watch and do nothing. Several townsmen shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Sarah's gaze. Barnes's face darkened with anger, but the cavalry officer's expression had become thoughtful. What do you propose? The officer asked. Surprising everyone, Mako straightened. Peace circle. 5 men from your side, 5 from mine. We talk, not shoot. Find a way, all can live. As the sun climbed higher and the standoff continued, Sarah found herself standing taller. Whatever came next, she would face it, knowing she had followed her conscience rather than her fear. The Apache warriors moved silently into their positions, prepared to defend her home as if it were their own. The next few minutes would determine whether her simple act of mercy would end in bloodshed or become the first step toward an unexpected peace. The Arizona territory would never be the same, but perhaps, just perhaps, it might become something better than anyone had dared to imagine. A tense silence hung over the ranch as Mako's proposal for a peace circle floated between the two sides. The cavalry officer and Sheriff Barnes conferred in hushed tones, occasionally glancing toward the ridges where additional Apache warriors allegedly waited. The townsfolk murmured among themselves, some eyeing their escape routes, others clutching their weapons tighter. Lieutenant Parker, the cavalry officer, finally announced, straightening in his saddle. 1st Cavalry, Fort McDowell. His voice carried the crisp authority of West Point training. I'm authorized to negotiate on behalf of the United States Army. Barnes stepped forward, face flushed with anger. Now wait just a minute, Lieutenant. This is territorial business. This became military business when they shot one of my scouts. Parker cut him off sharply. And it's about to become a massacre if we don't find another way forward. He turned back to Mako. 5 representatives. You said? Mako nodded once. 5, unarmed, under the shade tree. He pointed to the large cottonwood that stood halfway between the house and the gathered townsmen. Lieutenant Parker surveyed the situation, then made his decision. Agreed. Myself, the sheriff, Reverend Mitchell, and 2 others. He glanced at Barnes. "Choose wisely, Sheriff. Men who can listen, not just talk." Barnes's jaw tightened, but he recognized the shift in authority. "Henderson and Dr. Wilson," he said finally. "They've got level heads." From the porch, Sarah watched the proceedings with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "Will it work?" she asked quietly. One of the older Apache warriors, who had been silently observing nearby, answered in surprisingly good English. "Depends on what work means to you, woman. Peace today, maybe. Peace forever?" He shook his head. "Land remains. People remain. Hunger for both remains." His blunt assessment struck Sarah as painfully honest. Whatever happened today would not erase generations of conflict or the competing claims to the same territory. But perhaps it could prevent bloodshed. On her land, among these people in this moment. "I'll go too," she decided suddenly. "I should be there." Mako had returned to select his representatives. He considered her request with serious eyes. "Dangerous place between two enemies," he cautioned. "It's my land," Sarah replied simply. "My choice." After a moment, Mako nodded. "You speak for yourself. Not Apache, not white settlers." "I'll speak for what's right," she countered. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Bear Spirit chose well. Within minutes, the peace circle was arranged. 10 rustic chairs from Sarah's house were placed in a rough circle beneath the cottonwood tree. Lieutenant Parker, Sheriff Barnes, Reverend Mitchell, Henderson the livery owner, and Dr. Wilson approached from one side. Mako, Sarah, and 3 senior Apache warriors approached. From the other, all had left their weapons behind as agreed, though Sarah noticed Barnes had been reluctant to part with his pistol. As they seated themselves in the shade of the ancient tree, the contrast between the two groups was stark. The white men wore the dusty, weathered clothing of frontier life, with Lieutenant Parker's blue uniform standing out among them. The Apache representatives were adorned with symbols of their status: eagle feathers, intricate beadwork, and painted designs that Sarah now recognized as marks of honor rather than the war paint the townspeople feared. "Let us begin in a spirit of honest discourse," Reverend Mitchell suggested, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "We are all God's children, gathered under his sky." Barnes snorted derisively but said nothing. The Apache warriors remained impassive, while Lieutenant Parker studied each face carefully, assessing the situation. "Why have you come to Mrs. Mason's ranch in such numbers?" Parker asked directly, addressing Mako. "To honor debt," Mako replied. "She saved my life when your soldiers tried to take it." Parker frowned. "You were part of a scouting party observing a military installation. That makes you a legitimate target." "I carried white flag," Mako countered. "Message of peace from my father. Your soldiers shot without questions." The lieutenant's expression flickered with something like doubt. "Can you prove this?" "My word is proof," Mako said simply, "but also this." He carefully reached into a small pouch at his waist, movement slow to avoid alarming anyone. From it he withdrew a crumpled piece of paper with official military letterhead. "Invitation to speak. From Colonel James at Fort Apache, Lieutenant." Parker took the paper, eyes widening slightly as he read. "This appears authentic," he admitted, passing it to the others. "But it's addressed to Chief Nietzsche, not to you." "I am his voice when he cannot travel," Mako explained. "His son, his heir." Dr. Wilson leaned forward, medical curiosity overcoming his wariness. "That wound in your shoulder, rifle shot?" Mako nodded. "Army rifle, 2 days ago." "And Mrs. Mason tended it?" The doctor glanced at Sarah with new consideration. "She gave. Water when I thirsted, medicine when I suffered." Mako's intense gaze moved to Sarah. "Honor when others only give hate." Sheriff Barnes had been growing increasingly agitated. "This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the facts. These Apache have raided settlements, killed families. The Petersons, the Johnsons, the Miller boy, all dead at their hands." Not. These hands, one of the elder Apache warriors spoke up. Not Nietzsche's band. We follow peace path when possible. All Indians look the same to me, Barnes muttered. And that is why we fight, the warrior replied calmly. Because to you, we are not people with different tribes, different choices, just enemies to remove. Henderson, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. I lost my brother. To an Apache raid 5 years back, he said quietly. Carried that hate for a long time, but I've also traded with Apache hunters who dealt fair, shared water during the drought of 72. He looked around the circle. Maybe there's truth on both sides here. Lieutenant Parker was still studying the invitation. If what you say is true, and you were carrying a message of peace when my men fired on you, then a grave error has been made. His military bearing didn't falter, but genuine regret showed in his eyes, one that should be addressed appropriately. We all want the same things, Reverend Mitchell interjected. Safety for our families, food for our children, land to live on. But land is what we fight for, Mako pointed out. Your people want all land, leave none for Apache. There's plenty of territory, Barnes scoffed. You people just need to stay on the reservation where you belong. Sarah, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. The reservation lands can't support all the Apache bands, she said firmly. I've seen them. Poor soil, little water. You're asking them to slowly starve instead of quickly die. Barnes glared at her. Whose side are you on, Mrs. Mason? The side of truth, she replied evenly. And the truth is, we've pushed the Apache from their hunting grounds, broken promises, and then called them savages when they fought back. She turned to Lieutenant Parker. If Mako was carrying a peace message when he was shot, doesn't that warrant at least hearing what that message contained? Parker considered this, then nodded. Yes, it does. He addressed Mako directly. What terms was your father proposing? For the next hour, under the spreading branches of the cottonwood, an unprecedented discussion unfolded. Mako outlined his father's proposal. A buffer zone between Apache territories and white settlements, regulated trading posts where both sides could exchange goods fairly, and a system for addressing grievances that didn't immediately resort to violence. Lieutenant Parker listened with growing interest, occasionally asking clarifying questions or proposing modifications. Even Sheriff Barnes, initially dismissive, found himself engaged in practical considerations about enforcement and boundaries. The Apache elders contributed wisdom from generations of tribal knowledge, while Henderson and Dr. Wilson offered perspectives from the settlers' experiences. Throughout it all, Sarah watched in amazement as barriers of language and culture gradually lowered, not completely, but enough for genuine communication to occur. These men would never fully understand each other's worlds, but they were at least acknowledging that both worlds had the right to exist. The water rights along Copper Creek would need to be shared, Henderson pointed out, as they discussed boundaries. Both our cattle and yours need access, the eldest Apache warrior nodded slowly. In dry season, we have an ancient method. Each day is divided. Morning for one people, afternoon for other. No overlap, no conflict. Dr. Wilson leaned forward. With interest. That's remarkably similar to the irrigation schedules used in Spanish settlements further south. All people who live in desert understand water's value, the warrior replied simply. Barnes, though still resistant, had begun contributing practical concerns rather than merely objecting. How would we know you're raiders from other Apache bands? If there's trouble, how do we know who broke the agreement? Mako reached beneath his shirt and produced a small wooden token carved with distinctive symbols. Each man of Nietzsche's band carries this, sign of our tribe, our band, our honor. His eyes met Barnes's directly. We also wish to know which white men keep peace, which break it. Perhaps similar token for your people? The suggestion that responsibility for peace lay with both sides created a momentary silence. Then Lieutenant Parker nodded. That could work. Military identification is already standard. We could issue something similar to civilians in the agreement zone. Unexpected common ground continued to emerge. The Apache knew profitable mining locations they were willing to share in exchange for access to hunting grounds during certain seasons. They offered to help patrol against the marauding bands that troubled both communities. They even suggested joint healing gatherings where Dr. Wilson and Apache medicine people could exchange knowledge of the desert's plants and their properties. As the discussion wound down, Lieutenant Parker straightened in his chair. "I cannot make any binding agreements without authorization from my superiors," he said formally, "but I can recommend that Colonel James meet with Chief Nietzsche as originally intended." He glanced at the gathering of townsmen waiting anxiously beyond the circle. "And I can order my men to stand down today," Sheriff Barnes frowned. "And what about Mrs. Mason harboring enemies?" "Enemies?" Reverend Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "Seems to me she's done more for peace today than all the guns in the territory." He turned to Sarah with newfound respect. "Sometimes the bravest act is showing kindness when others show only fear." Barnes wasn't ready to surrender completely. The law also says we shouldn't shoot peace emissaries carrying military invitations," Lieutenant Parker interrupted sharply. "If we're going to start strictly enforcing all laws, Sheriff, perhaps we should begin with the Army's failure in this case." Henderson placed a steadying hand on Barnes's shoulder. "John, I've known you 20 years. You're a good man who wants to protect our town, but maybe protection looks different than we thought." He gestured toward the peaceful discussion they'd just had. "This protected more lives today than any gun." As they rose to conclude the meeting, Mako approached Sarah. The others moved away slightly, giving them a moment of privacy beneath the cottonwood's shade. "My father arrives by sunset," he said quietly. "He will honor what we have begun here." Sarah touched the bare claw pendant that still hung around her neck. "Will there really be peace?" "Not forever," Mako answered honestly. "But perhaps for longer than yesterday." His dark eyes held hers. "You have changed things, Sarah Mason. One cup of water, many ripples." "What happens now?" she asked, suddenly aware of how profoundly her life had shifted in just a few days. Mako glanced toward the horizon, where his father's band would soon appear. "Now you choose again. Each day is a new choice." "And you? Will you return to your people?" Something flickered in his expression, an emotion Sarah couldn't quite identify. "For now, but paths that cross once often cross again." He reached out, hesitated, then gently touched her hand. "Bear Spirit knows this." Sarah felt an unexpected warmth spreading through her at his touch. "I've lived alone since Thomas died. I thought that was my path forward." "Path is never a straight line," Mako said softly. "Like a river, it bends, with land it crosses." A shout from one of the Apache lookouts interrupted their moment. From the north came a cloud of dust, not from town, but from the opposite direction. Mako straightened, shielding his eyes against the sun. "My father," he said with quiet pride. Earlier than expected, Sarah followed his gaze to see a distant line of riders emerging from the heat-shimmered horizon. Even from this distance, their bearing was unmistakable, proud, disciplined, powerful. At their head rode a figure whose posture alone commanded respect. "How will he view me?" Sarah asked suddenly, anxiety coloring her voice. "A white woman on disputed land." Mako turned to her, his expression softening. "He will see what I see. Woman with courage to stand between two worlds. Woman who gives water when others give only bullets." The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Woman who wears Bear Spirit around her neck." Lieutenant Parker approached them, his gaze also fixed on the approaching riders. That would be Chief Naich, I presume. Marco nodded. My father comes to see peace talk with his own eyes. Parker straightened his uniform, a soldier preparing to meet an equal. I should inform Colonel James immediately. He hesitated, then extended his hand to Marco in a gesture that would have been unthinkable hours earlier. Thank you for your honesty today. It's not often I've been proven wrong in such a productive manner. Marco clasped the offered hand briefly. Honest mistakes can be mended. Dishonest peace cannot stand. Lieutenant Parker was already organizing the withdrawal of his men, while Sheriff Barnes reluctantly ordered the townspeople to disperse. Some left grumbling about weakness and betrayal, but others seemed relieved to avoid bloodshed. The Apache warriors watched silently from their positions, maintaining vigilance until the last rider disappeared back toward Copper Springs. As the sun began its western descent, Sarah stood on her porch and surveyed her land. The ranch that had seemed so empty just days ago now buzzed with the activity of Marco's warriors preparing for their chief's arrival. What would tomorrow bring? More conflict, more choices, more consequences rippling outward from her simple act of mercy. 1 cup of water, she murmured to herself, fingers brushing the bear claw pendant. Many ripples. Behind her, Dr. Wilson cleared his throat politely. He had lingered after the others departed, his medical bag in hand. That shoulder wound, he said, nodding toward where Marco stood directing his warriors. I'd like to examine it if he'll permit, ensure it's healing properly. Sarah studied the doctor with newfound appreciation. Thank you. That's unexpected. Wilson's weathered face creased in a thoughtful frown. Been doctoring in these parts 30 years, Mrs. Mason. Seen too many graves dug on both sides. He gazed across the bustling ranch yard. Maybe it's time I remembered my oath is to heal anyone in need, not just those who look like me. As Wilson moved toward Marco with his offer of medical assistance, Sarah noticed Reverend Mitchell approaching from where he'd tethered his horse. The elderly preacher walked with a slight limp, his expression contemplative. You've caused quite a stir, Mrs. Mason, he said, joining her on the porch. Some in town will call you traitor. Others might see something different. And what do you see, Reverend? Sarah asked quietly. Mitchell's eyes crinkled at the corners. I see scripture made real. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. He gazed toward the horizon where Chief Naich approached. Perhaps the Good Samaritan was more radical than we've allowed ourselves to believe. Sarah felt something tight in her chest loosen at his words. Not everyone would condemn her choices. As Mitchell departed with a gentle blessing, Sarah returned her attention to the transforming landscape before her. Her ranch, once a lonely outpost struggling against the harsh desert, now hummed with possibility. Lieutenant Parker had departed to report to his superiors, leaving behind 2 soldiers instructed to escort Chief Naich safely to the scheduled peace talks. Even Sheriff Barnes, though clearly unhappy, had ridden away without further threats. Whatever came next, Sarah Mason knew she would face it without regret. For the first time since Thomas died, her ranch felt like more than just land and buildings. It had become a crossroads between cultures, between enemies, between the world as it was and the world as it could be. And perhaps, though she hardly dared hope it, between 2 people who had found unexpected understanding beneath the vast Arizona sky. As Chief Naich's band drew closer, their figures clear against the golden afternoon light, Marco came to stand beside her on the porch. Without speaking, he pointed to a distant ridge where a single eagle soared in lazy circles above the desert. Good sign, he said simply. Clear vision, strong heart. Sarah watched the magnificent bird riding invisible currents, free and powerful, above a land that knew no boundaries until humans had drawn them. "What will you tell your father about me?" she asked. Marco's voice carried a warmth that made her pulse quicken. That Sarah Mason sees with eagle's eyes when others are blind, that she stands firm when others bend, that she gives life when others bring death. He turned to face her fully. That she belongs to no world because she creates her own. The approaching riders were close enough now that Sarah could make out details. The proud bearing of Chief Nietzsche at their head, the weathered faces of warriors who had survived against impossible odds, the curious gazes of those who wondered what kind of white woman would stand alongside Apache and defend their right to exist. "Are you ready?" Marco asked softly. Sarah straightened her shoulders and took a deep breath. The pendant felt warm against her skin, like it belonged there. "Ready?" she affirmed. Together, they stepped off the porch to greet a future neither of them could have imagined 2 days before, when a wounded Apache and a lonely widow's paths had crossed in the unforgiving Arizona desert. Chief Nietzsche brought his Mustang to a halt 20 paces from where Sarah and Marco stood. His presence commanded attention, tall and broad-shouldered, with deep lines etched into his copper face by decades of sun and struggle. Silver streaked his long black hair, which was adorned with eagle feathers and intricate beadwork that signified his status. Unlike his warriors, who wore minimal clothing appropriate for the desert heat, Nietzsche wore an elaborately decorated buckskin shirt with symbols Sarah couldn't decipher. For a long moment, the chief studied Sarah in silence, his dark eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. Then he dismounted with the fluid grace of a man half his age and approached. Marco stepped forward to greet his father, exchanging brief words in Apache that Sarah couldn't understand. Nietzsche nodded once, then turned, his penetrating gaze back to Sarah. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "My son tells me you gave water when his blood watered the earth, that you used medicine's skill when others would let him die." His voice was deep, resonant with authority earned through years of leadership in impossible circumstances. He says, "You stood between him and your own people today." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I did what any decent person would do." A flicker of something, perhaps amusement or respect, crossed Nietzsche's weathered face. "No, you did what few would dare." He glanced toward the town, then back to her. "Your people will not forgive such choice easily." "Some already have," Sarah replied, thinking of Reverend Mitchell and Dr. Wilson. "Others may never. I can live." With that, Nietzsche nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. "Marco says you wear bare spirit." His eyes moved to the pendant around her neck. "This is strong medicine, not given lightly." Sarah touched the carved bare claw, warm from resting against her skin. "I didn't ask for it. Spirit gifts are never asked for," Nietzsche said simply. "Only earned." The chief turned to survey Sarah's ranch, the modest house, the small barn, the struggling garden. His expression revealed nothing, but Sarah sensed he was assessing more than just buildings and land. He was measuring the worth of her life, her choices, her place in a changing world. "Lieutenant Parker has gone to arrange a council with your Colonel James," Marco explained, "to continue the peace talks that were interrupted." Nietzsche's expression hardened slightly. "Words mean little when bullets speak louder." "That may be changing," Sarah ventured. Lieutenant Parker seemed genuinely disturbed that a peace emissary was fired upon. "He wants to make amends." Amends. Nietzsche tested the word as if tasting unfamiliar food. Can amends return land taken? Lives lost? Children who starve on reservation dirt where nothing grows? Sarah had no answer for this harsh truth. The injustices Nietzsche spoke of were real and beyond any simple resolution. Yet the alternative, continued bloodshed on both sides, offered no hope either. "My husband died last winter," she said finally. Nothing can bring him back or erase my grief, but I still choose to live, to find a path forward. She met the chief's eyes directly. Isn't that what you're doing too? Seeking a way for your people to live, not just die fighting? For the first time, surprise registered on Nietzsche's face. Few white people, and certainly few women, would have dared speak so directly to him. After a moment, he inclined his head in acknowledgement. You have eagle's tongue to match an eagle's eyes, he said, echoing Mako's earlier words. Sharp. True. He gestured toward the cottonwood, where the peace circle had been held. Tell me of this talk. What words were spoken? What promises made? As the afternoon faded toward evening, Sarah found herself sitting in a circle with Chief Nietzsche, Mako, and several elder warriors recounting the day's negotiations. She explained Lieutenant Parker's willingness to arrange proper peace talks, the discussion of shared water rights, the proposed system for identifying members of each community, and the other practical matters that had been raised. Nietzsche listened, intently, occasionally asking sharp questions that revealed his deep understanding of both Apache needs and the reality of white settlement. He was neither naively optimistic nor blindly hostile, just a leader trying to navigate a narrow path between extinction and survival for his people. The lieutenant seemed sincere, Sarah concluded, and some of the townspeople are tired of living in fear. There's potential for real change. Potential, Nietzsche repeated, like seed before water, may grow, may die. He studied her thoughtfully. You believe in this seed? Before Sarah could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention. 2 riders approached from the direction of town, Lieutenant Parker and a soldier carrying a white flag. The Apache warriors tensed, hands moving to weapons, but Nietzsche raised his hand in a gesture of restraint. Parker reined in his horse at a respectful distance and dismounted. Alone, he walked forward, stopping several paces from where Nietzsche sat. Chief Nietzsche, he said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. I am Lieutenant James Parker, 1st Cavalry. I've come from Fort McDowell with a message from Colonel James. Nietzsche rose to his feet, his bearing every bit as dignified as the military officers. I listen. Colonel James extends his sincere regrets for the incident involving your son. He confirms that an invitation for peace talks was indeed issued, and that the shooting was a grave error by soldiers who failed to recognize the white flag. Parker's voice carried the formal tone of an official communication. He requests your presence at Fort Apache in 1 week's time to resume the discussions that were so unfortunately interrupted. Murmurs ran through the gathered Apache. Nietzsche's expression remained unreadable, but Sarah noticed his hands tighten slightly at his sides. Why should I trust words when actions speak differently? He asked. My son carried white man's paper and a peace flag. Still, they shot him. Parker nodded, acknowledging the legitimacy of the question. As a gesture of good faith, Colonel James has ordered all military patrols to maintain a 10-mile distance from your band's territory until the council. Additionally, he reached into his jacket and withdrew an official-looking document. This is a formal safe conduct pass for you and 20 warriors of your choosing, signed by the colonel and countersigned by the territorial governor. Nietzsche did not immediately reach for the document. Instead, he glanced at Sarah. Would you read this paper? Tell me if words are true or false. The request, with its implicit trust, caught Sarah by surprise. She stepped forward and accepted the document from Parker, carefully reading each line. The safe conduct was indeed as described, with additional provisions for food and supplies. To be provided during the council. The words are true, she confirmed, returning the paper to Parker, who then offered it to Nietzsche. The chief finally accepted the document, though he handed it to Mako for safekeeping. I will consider this invitation, he said formally. My answer will come in 3 days. Parker nodded, clearly understanding that this was the best response he could hope for at present. "I'll inform the colonel." He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, Chief Nietzsche, many of us believe that peace between our peoples is not only possible, but necessary. The old ways of conflict serve neither side well." As Parker prepared to depart, he turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Mason, your actions today have not gone unnoticed. The colonel expressly mentioned his gratitude for your role in preventing bloodshed. He'd like to extend an invitation for you to attend the council as well, as an independent witness, if you're willing." Sarah felt all eyes turn to her. Nietzsche's measuring gaze, Mako's intense attention, the curious stares of the Apache warriors. Her presence at official peace talks between the U.S. Army and the Apache would be unprecedented, particularly for a woman. She began, then found her voice. "I would be honored, but the decision is Chief Nietzsche's. I wouldn't presume to involve myself without his approval." Parker nodded, understanding the deference she showed to Apache protocol. All eyes turned to Nietzsche, who studied Sarah for a long moment before speaking. "The woman who stands between two worlds may help both sides see more clearly," he said finally. "If you choose to come, we welcome eagle eyes at council fire." After Parker departed, the Apache made camp around Sarah's ranch, their fires dotting the landscape like earthbound stars. Unlike the previous night when tension had filled the air, tonight carried a fragile hope. Warriors shared food with their families who had traveled with Nietzsche, children played under watchful eyes, and elders gathered to discuss the day's events. Sarah found herself welcomed at Nietzsche's fire, where Mako sat with his father and several tribal elders. As night deepened and conversation flowed in a mixture of Apache and English, she glimpsed a world far different from the savage caricature painted by frontier newspapers and saloon gossip. These were people with complex traditions, deep family bonds, and a sophisticated understanding of the desert environment that had sustained them for generations. Their stories spoke of resilience, adaptation, and a profound connection to the land that went beyond mere ownership. An elderly woman with silver hair and hands gnarled from decades of work approached Sarah, offering a small clay bowl filled with a fragrant stew. The woman's face was deeply lined, her eyes bright with intelligence as she studied the white woman in their midst. "My mother," Mako explained quietly. "She is keeper of our family's medicine knowledge." Sarah accepted the bowl with both hands, the gesture of respect coming naturally now. "Thank you," she said, trying the Apache word Mako had taught her earlier. "Ahi-yi-ye." The old woman's face creased in a surprised smile. She spoke rapidly to Mako, who translated with evident pride. "She says you have good spirit, that she knew when her son returned. Speaking of the woman with water, something important had begun." Sarah ate the stew, tender venison with wild herbs and desert vegetables she couldn't identify, but found delicious. As she finished, Mako's mother reached out with weathered fingers to touch the bear claw pendant, nodding with approval. "She says, bear spirit chose well," Mako translated. "That some paths are written in stars long before feet walk them." Around the fire, other conversations continued. Sarah listened as Nietzsche spoke with his advisors about the upcoming council, not with blind optimism, but with strategic clarity. They discussed which warriors would accompany him, what provisions they would need, and most importantly, what terms would be acceptable for their people's future. Reservation boundaries must be expanded to include Black Mountain hunting grounds, one elder insisted. "Without game, our children starve." Nietzsche nodded. "And water rights for Willow Creek. The soldiers dammed it last season, leaving our fields dry." Another warrior, his face scarred from past battles, spoke heatedly. "Words on paper mean nothing. White man's promises float away like smoke." Not all promises, Marco countered, his gaze briefly meeting Sarah's. Some stand firm as mountain. The debate continued, revealing to Sarah the complex internal politics of the Apache band. Not all agreed with Nietzsche's choice to pursue peace talks. Some younger warriors argued passionately for continued resistance, while others spoke of pragmatic compromise. Yet all deferred to their chief's wisdom, trusting his guidance even when they disagreed with his path. As the fire burned low, many retired to sleep, leaving Sarah alone with Marco beneath the star-filled Arizona sky. The air had cooled, carrying the sweet scent of desert sage and distant rain. "Your father is not what I expected," she admitted quietly. Marco smiled faintly. "Few see him truly. To army, he is enemy chief. To settlers, savage leader. To us, he is wisdom carrier, future seeker." He gazed toward where Nietzsche had retired. "He carries heavy weight, lives of all our people. What does he think of the Peace Council? Will he go?" "He will go," Marco said with certainty, not because he trusts army words, but because there is no other path that doesn't end in Apache bones bleaching in sun. His expression grew somber. "Our warriors are brave, but rifles and cannons cannot be defeated by courage alone." Sarah thought of the impossible position Nietzsche faced, trying to preserve his people's way of life against overwhelming odds. "And you? What role will you play?" Marco was silent for a moment, his profile strong against the starlit sky. "I will speak peace words as before, but now," he touched his healing shoulder, with stronger voice. "Your water gave more than life to one warrior. It gave hope to a people." The weight of his words settled over Sarah. Her simple act of compassion had somehow become entangled with the fate of the Apache, with military policy, with the future of the territory itself. The ripples had indeed spread far beyond where the stone had landed. "And after the council?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What then?" Marco turned to her, his dark eyes reflecting starlight. "For my people, perhaps a new path, not easy, not perfect, but path that leads forward instead of to ending." He hesitated, then added softly, "For me, path is less clear, but bare spirit has shown direction." His hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining with a tentative gentleness that belied his warrior strength. Sarah felt her breath catch, her heart racing at the simple contact. How strange that amid chaos and in conflict, amid cultural divides that seemed insurmountable, this connection had formed, unexpected, unplanned, yet undeniable. "My place is here," she said, gesturing to her ranch. "The land was my husband's dream, and I fought to keep it, but now it is more than land," Marco finished for her. "It is a meeting place, crossing the place." His fingers tightened, slightly around hers, place where water is given freely to all who thirst. In the distance, a coyote called to the night, its haunting voice echoing across the desert. Another answered from the opposite direction, separate yet connected by something primal and true. Sarah Mason had never imagined that a wounded enemy, found bleeding on her land, would transform her life so completely. She couldn't see clearly what the future held, for the territory, for the Peace Council, for herself and Marco. But for the first time since Thomas died, she felt something new taking root within her. Not just survival, but possibility. Not just endurance, but hope. The bear claw pendant rested against her heart, no longer foreign, but somehow right. Like the first drop of rain on parched earth. Like the first green shoot after wildfire, like water given freely when none was expected. Dawn found Sarah standing on her porch, watching as the Apache camp came to life with the rising sun. Women tended fires, children fetched water, warriors saddled horses for hunting parties. The scene struck her with its ordinary humanity. so different from the bloodthirsty stereotypes she had been raised to believe. "Your home looks different now," Mako observed, joining her on the porch, with life around it. Sarah nodded, realizing how empty her existence had been these past months, not just without Thomas, but without community. She had been surviving, nothing more. In the corral, several Apache women were teaching their children how to brush down the horses. Their laughter carried across the morning air, a sound Sarah realized had been missing from her life for too long. Nearby, two warriors were repairing a section of fence that had fallen during the standoff, working with practiced efficiency. "They don't have to do that," Sarah remarked, watching the men work. "In the Apache way, when you share shelter, you strengthen it," Mako explained. "Not gift or payment, just right living." One of the children broke away from the group at the corral, a small boy, perhaps 5 years old, clutching something in his hands. He approached the porch with determined steps, his dark eyes serious beneath a fringe of black hair. When he reached Sarah, he solemnly held up his offering, a small carved wooden horse, simple but beautifully rendered. Sarah knelt to accept the gift, touched by the gesture. "Thank you," she said softly. The boy didn't smile, but gave a dignified nod before scampering back to his mother, who watched the exchange with approving eyes. "My nephew," Mako said, pride evident in his voice. "He makes carvings like his father taught him. Gives only to those he respects." Sarah turned the small horse in her hands, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingers. "I've never received a finer gift." "What happens after Fort Apache?" she asked, watching the child rejoin his family. "If the peace holds?" Mako considered her question carefully. "My father believes we must learn new ways while keeping old wisdom. Some Apache will go to reservation, but with better terms, more land, water rights, freedom to hunt seasons. Others will learn white man's farming, trading, and you." Sarah's question held more weight than she intended. Mako turned to her, his expression open in a way it hadn't been before. "I was trained to speak between worlds, to translate not just words but ways of thinking." His eyes held hers steadily. "There will be need for such bridges in days ahead. Here, perhaps." "Here?" Sarah's heart quickened. "This land, your ranch, sits between territories, between peoples." Mako gestured toward the horizon. "Could be the place of meeting, of trade, of understanding." His voice softened. "If its keeper wills it." Before Sarah could respond, a rider approached from the direction of town. Not military or posse, but Reverend Mitchell, alone and unarmed. The old preacher dismounted stiffly, nodding respectfully to the Apache warriors, who watched him with understandable wariness. "Mrs. Mason," he called, approaching the porch. "The town is in quite a state after yesterday's events. I thought you should know." "Are they planning something?" Sarah asked, concern creeping into her voice. Mitchell shook his head. "Quite the opposite. News of Lieutenant Parker's peace initiative has split the community. Some stand with Barnes claiming betrayal. Others see opportunity." He smiled faintly. "Dr. Wilson has treated 3 Apache for minor ailments this morning. Henderson is discussing possible trade arrangements with some of the warriors. Even Franklin Reed is considering what merchandise might appeal to new customers." This news astonished Sarah. The same people who were ready to attack yesterday. "Fear and habit are powerful forces," Mitchell observed. "But profit and peace can be equally compelling when the possibility presents itself." He glanced toward where Chief Nietzsche was conferring with his advisors. "I've come with an invitation. Several town leaders would like to meet with the chief to establish their own accords ahead of the military council." Mako translated this request to his father. Nietzsche listened impassively, then responded with measured dignity. "My father says town leaders may come at midday," Mako relayed. 5 only? Unarmed, he will hear them. Reverend Mitchell bowed slightly. "I will convey his generous response." As he prepared to depart, he turned back to Sarah. "You've begun something remarkable here, Mrs. Mason. Whatever happens, remember that." As the day progressed, Sarah witnessed something she would have thought impossible just days ago. Apache warriors and townspeople cautiously interacting without bloodshed. The meeting between Nietzsche and the town representatives, including Henderson, Dr. Wilson, and surprisingly the owner of the general store, proceeded with formal courtesy on both sides. Practical matters dominated the discussion. The town needed access to hunting grounds the Apache controlled. The Apache needed manufactured goods and medicine. Both sides needed assurance against raids and reprisals. The solutions were imperfect, the trust fragile, but the very fact of their discussion represented profound change. By evening, when the town representatives departed, preliminary agreements had been reached, independent of the military negotiations. Yet to come, trading days would be established twice monthly at neutral grounds. Apache guides would help locate new water sources during the drought. Town doctors would provide medical care when needed. "It won't be easy," Mako said, as they watched the townsmen ride away. "Old hatreds run deep on both sides." "But it's a beginning," Sarah replied, "more than anyone thought possible." As twilight settled over the land, painting the desert in purples and golds, Sarah noticed a small group gathering near the eastern edge of her property. Several of the Apache elders, including Mako's mother, were arranging stones in a pattern she didn't recognize. Curious, she walked toward them, Mako at her side. "They prepare the ceremony," he explained quietly, "to honor new beginnings. And to remember those lost on both paths." "May I watch?" Sarah asked, unsure of the protocol. Mako's expression softened. "Not just watch. My mother has asked if you will join." The invitation moved Sarah deeply. She followed Mako to where the elders had created a circle of stones with 4 openings facing the cardinal directions. In the center, a small fire was being kindled, its flames growing stronger as darkness fell. "What should I do?" she whispered. "Follow. Listen. Be present," Mako replied simply. The ceremony began with Nietzsche entering the circle from the eastern opening. He carried a pipe decorated with eagle feathers and intricate beadwork. Behind him came other tribal members, moving with reverent steps to form a circle around the fire. Sarah and Mako entered last, from the western direction. What followed transcended language. Though Sarah couldn't understand the Apache words spoken by the elders, their meaning resonated in her heart. There was gratitude for lives preserved, remembrance for those lost, and hope for the path ahead. When the sacred pipe was passed, each participant took a ceremonial draw before passing it to the next person. When it reached Sarah, she hesitated only briefly before accepting it with both hands, as she had seen the others do. The simple act of inclusion in this sacred ritual felt more significant than any written treaty or formal agreement. Later, as the fire burned low and the stars emerged in full brilliance above, soft singing began. The melody was unlike any Sarah had heard in church or social gatherings. It seemed to rise from the earth itself, ancient and true. Though she didn't join in, the music washed over her, connecting her to this moment, these people, this land in a way she had never experienced. That night, beneath a sky ablaze with stars, Sarah and Mako walked to the ridge where she had first found him bleeding into the desert soil. The spot seemed transformed now, no longer a place of chance encounter, but the beginning of a journey neither had anticipated. Standing on the ridge, Sarah looked out over her transformed ranch. Apache teepees dotted the landscape, their smoke rising straight toward the stars in the still night air. Her home, once isolated and lonely, now pulsed with life, with possibility, with future. "When I found you here," she said softly, "I almost walked away." Marco nodded, understanding the weight of that moment. Many would have. Fear speaks loudly. What made me stay? She wondered aloud. What made me choose differently than I was? Untaught, Marco considered her question carefully, his profile strong against the starlit sky. Some spirits listen beyond fear, he said finally. Hear deeper voices, true voices. He touched the bear claw pendant at her throat, his fingers warm. Against her skin, bear spirit sees true path when others are lost in shadow. Sarah felt the world shift subtly beneath her feet, as if the earth itself acknowledged this moment of connection. She had crossed a boundary she hadn't known existed, not just between Apache and settler, but between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. "Tomorrow your father begins preparation for the council," she said, bringing herself back to practical matters. "Will you go with him?" "I must," Marco replied. "My voice is needed, as a peace speaker, as one who has walked between worlds." His hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining with gentle strength. But paths that separate can join again, if both travelers wish it. The question hung unspoken between them, filled with both possibility and uncertainty. Sarah Mason, widow of Thomas, respected by her town, owner of a struggling ranch. Marco, son of Chief Nietzsche, wounded peace emissary, warrior with the soul of a bridge builder. Two people from worlds that had known only conflict, standing together beneath the vast Arizona sky. "I wish it," Sarah whispered, the words carrying more weight than any she had spoken before. Marco's eyes, reflecting starlight, held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Then it will be," he said simply, with the certainty of one who had survived bullets and hatred to find something worth believing in. In that moment, on the very spot where days ago she had made the choice to offer water to a wounded enemy, Sarah, Mason and Marco sealed their connection with a kiss as gentle as rain on parched earth. Not a ending, but a beginning. Not a conclusion, but a promise. 3 days later, as Chief Nietzsche's band prepared to depart for the council at Fort Apache, Sarah stood on her porch, watching the organized chaos of breaking camp. Nietzsche had formally accepted Lieutenant Parker's invitation, sending a runner to inform the colonel of his decision. Now, warriors packed provisions, secured weapons, and readied horses for the journey. Sarah's preparations were simpler: a small bag containing a change of clothes, the wooden horse given by Marco's nephew, and a letter from Reverend Mitchell, formally appointing her as the town's civilian representative. The document had no legal standing, but it represented something profound: her community's grudging acceptance of her new role as bridge between worlds. Not everyone approved, of course. Sheriff Barnes had made his disapproval clear, refusing to sign the letter and warning that consorting with savages would destroy her reputation. But enough townspeople had recognized the potential benefits of peace to support her unexpected mission. As she secured her bag to her saddle, Marco approached, dressed in formal attire for the council, buckskin shirt adorned with tribal symbols of honor, hair bound with a ceremonial band. Bear claw necklace now returned to his throat, alongside a second pendant she hadn't seen before. "A gift," he explained, noticing her curious glance. "From my father, symbol of peace speaker." His expression grew serious. "The council will not be easy. Many on both sides prefer war to understanding. They will speak against what we begin here." "Then we'll speak louder," Sarah replied with newfound determination. "Not with shouts, but with truth." Chief Nietzsche approached on his painted stallion, the morning sun glinting off the silver and turquoise that adorned his ceremonial dress. His weathered face revealed nothing as he surveyed Sarah's ranch one final time. "This place will be remembered," he said finally, his deep voice carrying in the clear morning air. "Where water was given, where words replaced bullets, where the path divided. He looked directly at Sarah. "You ride with us as friend of Apache. Honor of my people goes with you." With that simple ceremony, Sarah Mason took her place among the May Apache band riding toward Fort Apache. Behind her, the ranch stood empty but not abandoned, a place changed forever by the choices made beneath its sky, a crossroads waiting for her return. Some choices ripple outward forever, changing everything. In their path, as Sarah rode beside Mako toward an uncertain future, the bear claw warm against his skin and the memory of her touch warm within his heart, she understood that the true power of mercy wasn't in grand gestures or historic treaties, but in the quiet courage to see humanity where others saw only enemies. That was the lesson of the water cup, the wounded warrior, and the ranch that had become a crossroads between two worlds. That was the story that would be told long after the Arizona territory had faded into history. How a widow's compassion began a journey toward peace that neither Apache nor settler could have imagined alone. That was the legacy of Sarah Mason and Mako, son of Nietzsche, who found in each other a truth stronger than hatred, more enduring than conflict, and as essential as water in the desert. A truth as old as humanity itself, that sometimes the bravest battles are won not with bullets or arrows, but with the simple, revolutionary power of recognizing oneself in the eyes of the enemy. 5 years later, 1883. The trading post at Mason's Crossing bustled with activity under the warm spring sun. Apache families mingled with settlers, exchanging goods, stories, and occasional laughter across what had once been an unbridgeable divide. Women from both communities shared knowledge of desert plants and their medicinal properties, while children played together in the dusty yard, their games transcending the language barriers that still sometimes challenged their elders. Sarah Mason, now known to many as Sarah Mason Nietzsche, moved among them with practiced ease, a small, leather-bound ledger in hand as she recorded transactions and resolved minor disputes. At 37, she carried herself with the quiet authority of a woman who had found her purpose. The years had added a few strands of silver to her brown hair, but also a depth to her eyes that spoke of wisdom hard-won. "Mrs. Nietzsche," called Henderson, now grey-bearded but still running the livery in Copper Springs. "That stallion you traded last month has sired the finest foal I've seen in years, worth every penny," Sarah smiled, making a note in her ledger. "Tell Walking Fox when he arrives. He takes great pride in his horse breeding." "Will do," Henderson replied, tipping his hat respectfully before moving on to examine a display of intricately tanned deer skin. The trading post had grown from humble beginnings. Initially, just a monthly gathering beneath the cottonwood tree, where the Peace Circle had first formed. Now it boasted a permanent structure with a broad porch, housing not just commerce, but also the region's first school, where children from both communities learned together 3 days each week. Sarah glanced toward the classroom where Mary Wilson, the doctor's daughter, was teaching today. Through the open window came the sound of young voices reciting in both English and Apache, a small miracle in a territory still fraught with tension beyond their boundaries. By the south wall, Dr. Wilson himself had established a small clinic where he practiced medicine 2 days a week. True to his word after that fateful day 5 years ago, he had dedicated himself to learning Apache healing traditions, incorporating their herbal knowledge into his treatments while sharing modern medical techniques with the tribe's medicine people. His presence had saved countless lives, both Apache and settler, during the smallpox outbreak 2 winters past. Franklin Reed, once one of the most vocal opponents of Indian sympathizers, now operated a satellite branch of his general store. From the trading post, having discovered that commerce was indeed a powerful motivator for cooperation, He still grumbled occasionally about uncivilized ways, but the profit from trading Apache crafts to Eastern collectors had softened his prejudice considerably. The Fort Apache Agreement, as it had come to be known, had not brought universal peace to the Arizona Territory. Other Apache bands still resisted, other towns still harbored hatred, and the military still made grievous errors of judgment. But here, in this small corner of the desert, something different had taken root and flourished. "Riders coming," announced a young Apache boy from his perch in the cottonwood. "From the east." Sarah shaded her eyes, watching the approaching dust cloud with practiced assessment. Her hand moved instinctively to the bear claw pendant that never left her throat, its surface smooth from years of touching. "It's them," she said, breaking into a smile as she recognized the lead rider's distinctive silhouette. Mako rode at the head of a small delegation returning from territorial negotiations in Tucson. The years of serving as his father's voice, and later as an official liaison between the Apache and the territorial government, had added gravitas to his bearing, though his eyes still held the same intensity that had first captured Sarah's heart. On a blood-soaked ridge, behind him rode Thomas, their 4-year-old son, proudly perched on his own pony. The boy embodied the bridge they had built, his features a perfect blend of both parents, his nature as determined as his father's and as compassionate as his mother's. Already he moved effortlessly between both worlds, equally comfortable in Apache ceremonies and town gatherings. At Thomas's side rode Little Fox, Mako's younger sister, who had become like a second mother to the boy. Her skill with horses was legendary among both Apache and settlers, and she had become an essential part of Mason's Crossing, training cavalry mounts that commanded premium prices. More importantly, she had been the first Apache woman to serve on the trading post's governing council, her keen intelligence and diplomatic skills helping navigate many delicate situations between the cultures. Following them came 3 Apache warriors and 2 cavalry officers, an unusual sight that still raised eyebrows in other settlements but had become commonplace at Mason's Crossing. These joint patrols, established after the 2nd year of the agreement, had reduced bandit attacks on both communities and helped build trust between former enemies. One of the officers, Lieutenant James Scott, had been among those who'd initially fired upon Mako during that fateful peace mission. Now he served as the military's primary liaison to the Apache bands, his remorse for past actions transformed into dedication to a different path. The scar on his cheek from a knife fight with raiders who had attacked both Apache and settler families had earned him respect among the warriors he once hunted. As the riders approached, Sarah stepped off the trading post porch to meet them. Mako dismounted with the same fluid grace she had always admired, though the old wound in his shoulder sometimes troubled him in cold weather. He embraced her briefly but warmly, the public gesture a compromise between Apache reserve and settler customs. "How were the talks?" she asked, helping Thomas down from his pony while the boy chattered excitedly about the journey. "Progress comes slowly," Mako replied, his English now fluid after years of diplomatic work. "Governor proposes new boundaries for hunting territories, better than before, not as good as needed." His expression remained serious, but a faint smile touched his lips as he watched their son run off to show his friends a feather he had found on the trail. "And Naiche?" Sarah asked, referring to her father-in-law with the respect his position commanded. "My father grows tired of words on paper," Mako admitted. "But he sees value in Thomas's future. He fights now for what will come, not just what is." "The cattle ranchers from Texas continue to push for more restrictions," added Lieutenant Scott, dismounting nearby. "But Judge Morrison supports the Apache claims to their traditional hunting grounds. He cited the success here as evidence that coexistence is possible." Judge Harold Morrison had been another unexpected ally. Originally sent by the territorial governor to investigate complaints about Indian sympathizers at Mason's Crossing, he had instead become convinced of the value of their experiment. His legal rulings had established important precedents protecting Apache rights throughout the territory, often putting him at odds with powerful mining and cattle interests. "Any news of the southern bands?" Sarah asked, knowing those Apache. Groups who had refused to join the agreement continued to face persecution. Mako's expression darkened. "Army drives them further into mountains, less land each season, more hunger." It was the shadow that hung over their success, the knowledge that while they had created something remarkable at Mason's Crossing, other Apache bands faced extermination or the slow death of reservation life. Sarah and Mako had made several attempts to expand their model to other regions, with mixed results. Not all Apache leaders trusted the peace process. Not all settler communities were willing to try. "We brought letters," Little Fox interjected, changing the subject as she handed Sarah a small bundle tied with string. "From the governor's office and from that newspaper woman from New York." Sarah accepted the bundle with interest. Rebecca Wallace, a journalist from the New York Tribune, had visited Mason's Crossing last autumn, skeptical of rumors about peaceful coexistence between settlers and Apache. She had departed 3 weeks later with filled notebooks and a promise to tell the East the truth about what's possible in the West. Her subsequent articles had brought both unwanted attention and valuable support from Eastern reformers. They walked together toward the small house adjacent to the trading post, their home when not traveling between Apache settlements and territorial outposts. It was a blend of both worlds, with sturdy log walls and a traditional adobe fireplace decorated with both Apache crafts and Sarah's family heirlooms. On the porch sat Mako's mother, now elderly but still sharp-eyed, showing a young settler woman how to weave a basket from desert grasses. The old woman glanced up as they approached, her weathered face creasing with affection. "Grandson rides like warrior," she said proudly in Apache. "Sits tall like his father." Sarah responded in the same language, her facility grown with years of practice. "And talks non-stop like his mother, you were going to add." The old woman chuckled, the sound like dry leaves rustling. "Truth needs no adding." Next to Mako's mother sat Clara Henderson, the livery owner's widowed daughter-in-law, her fingers awkwardly attempting to mimic the elder's weaving pattern. Clara had arrived at Mason's Crossing 2 years ago, fleeing an abusive second husband. With her infant daughter, she had found not just refuge, but a community that valued her bookkeeping skills and quiet determination. Her transformation from fearful outsider to confident resident mirrored the larger changes the trading post had fostered. "Sarah," Clara called, setting aside her half-finished basket. "The supply wagon from Tucson brought those seed catalogs you were waiting for. And there's a letter from that senator in Washington, the one interested in what we're doing here." Senator William Bedford had discovered Mason's Crossing almost by accident during a fact-finding tour of Western territories. Impressed by what he'd seen, he had become an advocate in Washington for a new approach to Indian relations, though his colleagues often dismissed him as an idealistic fool. Still, his support had helped protect the agreement during its fragile early days. Inside, Sarah poured cool water from a clay pitcher, a daily ritual that never lost its significance for either of them. Every sip a reminder of that first offering that had changed everything. The interior of their home reflected the blending of their lives. Thomas's toys scattered alongside territorial maps marked with treaty boundaries, Apache artwork hanging near Sarah's family Bible, and a bookshelf filled with volumes in both languages. "Sheriff Barnes died last week," she said quietly, handing Mako a cup. "Pneumonia, according to Dr. Wilson." Mako received the news with the respectful solemnity the Apache accorded to all deaths, even those of former enemies. "He lived as he believed right, though his path was not ours," Reverend Mitchell will conduct the service tomorrow. He asked if we would attend. Sarah watched her husband carefully, understanding the complexity of the request. Barnes had remained opposed to their union until the end, one of the few townspeople who never accepted the changes at Mason's Crossing. In his final years as sheriff, he had deliberately routed patrols away from the trading post, refusing to provide protection even when requested. When Thomas was born, Barnes had publicly declared that half-breeds would be the downfall of decent society. His bitterness had only hardened with time as he watched Mason's Crossing prosper while his influence waned. Yet Reverend Mitchell, now stooped with age but still a powerful voice for reconciliation, believed their presence at the funeral would be a powerful symbol to those still clinging to old hatreds. "Mercy shown to enemies in death," he had written in his note, "speaks louder than victory in life. We will go," Marco decided, "to honor what has passed and what may come." He set down his water cup and drew Sarah close, their foreheads touching in the intimate gesture they had shared countless times over the years. One cup of water, many ripples, still spreading. Through the open window came the sound of Thomas, laughing as he showed his treasured feather to Singing Bird, the daughter of Walking Fox. The two children had been inseparable since infancy, their friendship a natural extension of the community their parents had built. All the children gathered around them, Apache and settler offspring who had never known a world where the other was enemy. "Rebecca's article mentioned Thomas," Sarah said, unfolding one of the letters from the bundle. "She calls him living proof. That understanding between races is not just possible but necessary for America's future." Marco smiled faintly. Big words for small boy who still cannot remember to wash hands before eating. "The Eastern reformers want to use Mason's Crossing as a model for other territories," Sarah continued, scanning the letter. "They're requesting our testimony before a congressional committee next autumn." "Washington is far," Marco observed, his expression thoughtful, "but perhaps worth journey if words can help other bands avoid reservation suffering." He gazed out the window at the trading post grounds where Apache and settler lives intertwined, in everyday commerce and conversation. "What we build here is small seed in large desert, needs more water to grow beyond our sight." Later that evening, as sunset painted the desert in gold and crimson, Sarah and Marco walked to the ridge that had become their special place. The spot where she had once found him bleeding was now marked by a circle of smooth stones, not a grave, but a birthplace, the origin point of everything that followed. Thomas ran ahead of them, collecting interesting pebbles and chattering about his adventures in Tucson. His easy movement between languages mirrored his natural belonging in both worlds. Perhaps the most precious outcome of that long-ago choice to offer water instead of fear. The territorial governor mentioned expanding. "The agreement," Marco said as they reached the stone circle, "adding 3 more bands to protected hunting grounds." "Will it help the southern groups?" Sarah asked, knowing those Apache had suffered the most from military campaigns. "Some, not all." Marco's expression was pragmatic. "But each band that joins makes voice stronger in territorial council. The agreement had evolved substantially from its beginnings at Fort Apache. What had started as a tenuous truce between Nietzsche's band and the military had gradually expanded to include broader rights and protections. With each new Apache group that joined, with each settlement that established trading relations, the foundation grew stronger. Not perfect, far from it, but better than the alternatives of extermination or imprisonment on barren reservations. Sarah watched Thomas arranging his collected stones in patterns only he understood. "Sometimes I still dream about that day," she admitted quietly. "Finding you on this ridge, what might have happened if I'd chosen differently." "Dreams show paths not taken," Marco said, placing his arm around her shoulders. "But we walk path, that is." Below them, Mason's Crossing glowed in the fading light. Cooking fires twinkled like earthbound stars, both in the permanent structures, and in the Apache camp that still accompanied Naiche whenever he visited. From this distance, it was impossible to distinguish between them, just a community preparing for evening, people sharing food and stories as humans had done since the beginning of time. "Do you ever wonder," Sarah asked softly, "what would have happened if I had walked away that day? If I had gone for the sheriff instead of the water?" Mako considered the question, his profile strong against the setting sun. Some paths are seen clearly only after walking them. Others remain shadow trails, unwatched. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "I believe the bear spirit already knew what paths we would choose." Behind them came the sound of hoofbeats, little Fox approaching with her characteristic energy. "Thomas promised to help me with the new foal," she called, smiling at her nephew, "if his parents permit." Thomas looked up with pleading eyes, his collection of stones momentarily forgotten. "Please, mother. Father, the black mare's baby needs me." Sarah smiled, nodding permission. "Be careful. Mind your aunt's instructions." As Thomas raced back toward the trading post with his aunt, his small figure silhouetted against the sunset, Sarah leaned against Mako's shoulder. "Your sister has been good for him, for all of us." "She walks between worlds like you," Mako observed. "Fearless, sees with clear eyes." Little Fox had been among the first Apache to fully embrace the possibilities of Mason's Crossing, learning English faster than most, adapting to new ways while maintaining her cultural identity. Her skill with horses had initially earned respect from skeptical settlers, but her intelligence and warmth had transformed that respect into genuine friendship. Now she was courting a young rancher from north of Copper Springs, another boundary about to be crossed, another connection about to be forged. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared above the desert, Sarah Mason Naish stood between worlds, no longer forced to choose one over the other, but creator of something new that honored both. The trading post lights glowed warmly below, a beacon of possibility in a harsh land. One cup of water, a wounded enemy, a choice made from the heart rather than from fear. Some stories end. Others continue to ripple outward forever, touching lives not yet born, creating possibilities not yet imagined, reminding all who hear them that the most powerful force on earth is not hatred or bullets or bloodshed, but the simple courage to see the humanity in another's eyes, especially when those eyes belong to someone you've been taught to fear. And that, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.